Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Martin Tompa started his career as a theoretical computer scientist. I was aware of his work even when I was still in grad school. For example, his beautiful paper studying time-space trade-offs for computing functions, or his work with Borodin, I have to check my notes here, with Borodin and Russo, proving lower bounds on universal traversal sequences, like solving, an elegant solution to a long-standing open problem in combinatorics. But after many years of making beautiful contributions to theory, he decided to switch fields completely and became a computational biologist, where he also made very seminal contributions, developing methods that are widely used in genome analysis. But so as not to offend anyone who came here wanting to avoid any mention of computer science, and before I let him start, let me just mention a few of the other unique things, of the many other unique things about Martin. So first, Martin is an amazing teacher, one of the best in our school. In fact, he won the first 2 ACM Undergraduate Teaching Awards. And he had a unique style for giving lectures. He would prepare one densely, beautifully written, perfectly handwritten, 2-sided piece of paper, and he would hold it something like this. And so he'd see exactly one line as he was writing on the board. And he would be able to rotate this perfectly. As you can see, I can't do it. And give the lecture that way. So I'm a little bit disappointed that you're using slides, but, but that's okay. More seriously, though, he taught many of us about how to listen by the way he interacted with students. So when a student has a question, would ask Martin that question, Martin was completely focused on them, intensely so. And in a way that made them felt like what they were asking and them as people were like the most important thing in the world. And then as soon as the questioner would complete their question, he would say, "Good." And he would repeat the question back to them to make it clear that he really understood the question. So this is called reflective listening, and the psychology field encourages us to do it. So if you want to have a good experience, you should ask Martin a question today. Third, Martin also holds the record as the person who's been hired the largest number of times by our school. He was one of the first few faculty members in CSC back when it was CS in the late 70s, having been hired directly out of grad school. But when his wife, Anne, wanted to pursue an MD on the East Coast, Martin gave up his faculty position and joined IBM TJ Watson, where he became head of the theory group, until Anne finished her MD. And then when she finished, she got a residency here in Seattle, so Martin applied for the second time for a position here. And surprise, surprise, he was the best candidate, and we hired him back. And of course, with his retirement, this now means he's chosen to give up a faculty position more times than anyone else here. And one final thing I should mention that you may not be aware of is that he is a master, I dare say the master, of the game of Schnapsen. And lest you think that Schnapsen was just a minor side gig for Martin, whenever he taught CSE 312, our undergraduate probability course, he would make the students learn how to play Schnapsen, and then he would use Schnapsen to help them understand probability using the Schnapsen scenarios. And of course, he also invited the whole class every week on Friday to the Friday Schnapsen Club, where they would play Schnapsen. And he actually wrote the definitive book on Schnapsen. You can find it on Amazon. The book jacket blurb says that it is the most fascinating 2-player game. I assume you mean more than the game of war. More fascinating. Anyway, from reading Martin's book, I learned that Schnapsen is, of course, played with a deck of 20 cards, unlike 66, the game it resembles, which uses 24 cards. And unlike 66, the 9 is not used in Schnapsen, obviously. I also read through the reviews of Martin's book on Schnapsen on Amazon. They are amazing, referring to the book as the Schnapsen Bible or a masterpiece on an intriguing game of subtle strategy. Another reviewer wrote, and this is a quote, "In all honesty, I'd purchase a second volume if it were to be published." But I also noticed that the price for the Kindle version is $0, so probably not a way for you to make money in the future. Anyway, let me end this way too long introduction by saying that Martin is an absolute one of a kind. Crystal clear, brilliant thinker, funny and creative, thoughtful and kind, a person of the highest integrity. We've been very lucky to have him here, and I'm sorry for the people that don't get to experience him, who are the young people. But anyway, please join me in welcoming Emeritus Professor Martin Tompa.
Thank you, Anna, for that very flattering introduction, and also for saving me some time in my lecture, because now I don't have to explain what Schnapsen is. I'm very, very happy to see so many people here. Thanks all for coming. So let me begin by dissecting the title of the talk. And we'll begin with the word valedictory. So what is a valedictory? Well, if you look in Webster, you'll find that it's an address or statement of farewell. All right, kind of bare bones, but I think I can live up to that in today's talk, as long as I say farewell sometime during the talk. So Noah Webster is all well and good, but if we want to truly understand the nuances of the word valedictory, we need to go to a real wordsmith, and that's Larry Snyder. Larry defined a valedictory as a concept with a British pedigree, a ponderous speech on an arcane topic of no apparent interest to anyone but the speaker. So my goal today is to see whether I can live up to that meaning. All right, now for the second half of the title, Who Am I? Let me explain where that came from. And to do this, I'm going to give you a very brief curriculum vitae, but I'm going to do it in terms of the identity crises that I've gone through during my career. So we start in the year 1974. This is shockingly now 50 years ago this year. This is the year that I graduated from college. And I faced my first identity crisis. So in order to explain this, let me say that I had been bitten by the programming bug in the very first lecture I took my freshman year in college. And in the words of the professor who taught that course, what I discovered is that programming was the cat's pajamas. So here it was in 1974, I was graduating. I moved to the University of Toronto to go to graduate school and tried to think about what I should study in graduate school. And I realized, much to my surprise, that I had really enjoyed the theory classes I had taken as an undergraduate. And so I thought, well, maybe I should focus on theoretical computer science. Could I make it in that area? So my first identity crisis was, who am I if I'm not a programmer? It worked out. I managed to do a thesis in theory and finished graduate school in 1978, at which time I came here and joined the faculty and joined the theory group in CSE. As Anna said, 7 years later, my wife Anne was accepted to medical school in New York Medical College. So we picked up and moved across the country again to New York, where I took a position at IBM Research. And my worry at that time was I really going to miss students and teaching? Because I absolutely loved teaching. So who am I if I'm not a professor? Well, this again turned out fine. IBM Research was a great place to work. I enjoyed focusing on research. We were there until 1989 when Anne graduated from medical school. And then we picked up and moved back to Seattle, where, as Anna told you, we were fortunate, well, I was fortunate that CSE was willing to take me back again as a faculty member, and I rejoined the theory faculty. Now we come to 1998. In 1998, Larry Rizzo and I were quite intrigued by molecular biology and the revolution that was going on in molecular biology. This was the middle of the Human Genome Project, and a number of molecular biologists were trying to recruit computer scientists to work on biology problems. This may have been my biggest identity crisis because I knew nothing about biology. And if I was going to reinvent myself as a computational biologist, it meant taking biology classes, reading introductory textbooks, attending seminars, and trying to learn the basics of this field so that I could make some contribution to it. But I spent the second half of my research career doing computational biology, and it turned out to be a blast. It was really, really fun and very, very interesting. In 2014, I made the decision to give up 50% of my position as an experiment in retirement. I wanted to see what retirement would be like. And in an unusual move, the 50% that I gave up was the research part, so that I could focus on teaching undergrads, and in particular, as Anna said, teaching the probability and statistics class, which is what I taught most often. And so the question here was, who am I if I'm not a computer science researcher? What would it be like not to be involved in research? Well, after 6 years of that experiment, I decided the experiment had been a success, and I was ready to retire, which I did in 2020. Now, all those previous crises had all been questions of what sort of computer scientist am I? But in 2020, when I retired, the question was, who am I if I'm not a computer scientist at all? What am I going to do with my life? And that's what the experiment had been for, to try to explore that question. So that's the question that I want to address in today's talk. I want to tell you what it is I'm doing in my retirement, and it's not computer science, as you'll see. Now, there may be one more identity crisis coming up sometime in the future. And when I know more about this, I'll get back to you. All right. So what my passion has been, probably for 20 years now, but I've had the time to devote to it since my retirement, is on genealogy and family history. And I think of these as two different topics, slightly different topics, certainly related, but slightly different. So in genealogy, what you're doing is building your family tree. And the question that I want to explore there is, who were my ancestors? And it's really broader than who were my ancestors. I really want to know who were all of my relatives, all my distant cousins. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the first part of the talk. The trouble with genealogy is when you're studying distant times and distant places, you really can't learn much detail about the lives of these relatives. If you're lucky, you'll learn their names and some dates and some places, but you don't know much about what their lives were like. Maybe for their life, you might be able to find out what their profession was, so that gives you some hint about their lives. But that's about it. And so in the family history part of my interests, what I'm interested in doing is getting a much fuller picture of what my relatives' lives were like. And so in that part of the talk, I'll focus on much more recent family history, in particular, the history of my parents and their families and what their lives were like in the 20th century. So that'll be the second part. But let's start with genealogy. So I'm going to show you my mother's family tree to begin with. And this is a Bohemian tree. For those of you who don't know, Bohemia is what's now the western half of the Czech Republic. And that's where my mother's ancestors were from. So I'll show you that family tree with lots of Bohemians in it. I also similarly have a family tree for my father's family. And that family tree is a Hungarian tree. My father was born in Hungary, and that's where the family came from. All right, let's begin with my mother's family tree. So this is my mother's family tree. Down here at the root is my mother. Her name was Lisa Fikes. Behind her, here's my father, Peter Tompa. And her ancestors, all the ones I know about, are higher up in the tree. But let me go a little lower for just a moment, because you need to see where I am in this tree so you can see how I'm related. So down here would normally be all of the descendants of my mother, but I'm showing only myself. I've stripped out the names and dates of all her other descendants in order to protect their privacy. But all you need down there is me. Okay, so now let's look at the ancestors, which is what I was really interested in. If you're at any node in this tree, you get to the father by taking the left branch, and you get to the mother by taking the right branch. Another way to tell women from men here, the women all have borders that are red, and the men have borders that are blue. I need to scroll a little further. All right. I'd like to read off for you some of the given names of some of these ancestors. So let's start with, let's see, this is my grandmother, this is my great-great-great-grandmother. And her given name was Esther. Her husband's name was Moses. Her mother's name was Rachel. Her father's name was Zacharias. And here's another ancestor, Abraham. Okay, now you'll probably recognize that these are all Old Testament names. And you might guess from that my ancestors were Jewish. And that would be correct. Both of my parents were born into Jewish families in Europe. All right, so let's see, how far back can we go here? Let's try to get to that highest point. So this is my grandfather, whoops, I went the wrong way. Great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Right, so the farthest back I can go is to Kona Kornfeld, who was however many greats I said. That's how far back he is. He was born probably in around 1650 or 1660. So this is not terribly far back as genealogy goes. A lot of genealogists have traced their families much farther back, but that's as far as I've been able to trace it. All right, now I said I was interested not just in who my ancestors were, but also my other relatives. And so let's pick a different ancestor. So here's an ancestor whose name was Josef Ruzicka. And if I click on Josef's link, what it shows is all of his descendants, or at least all the descendants that I know of. Josef was married to Judita. They had a son, Solomon, who was one of my ancestors, but they had other children as well. So there are a few off here to the right, and let's focus on the ones off to the left here. And another son off to the left. I can tell it's a son because it's blue. This son married and had 1, 2, 3, 4 children. This daughter married and had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children, and etc. All right. So I'm just trying to help you read this tree. All right. So these are all the descendants of Joseph and Judita, or at least all the descendants that I know. Probably there are many more that I haven't found yet, and I'm still working on it. All right. That's actually a fairly small descendant tree. Let's take a look at another one. If we go over here to David Küchler and Sarah Lerbel, and I click on either of them, let me scroll down a little bit. Let's take a look at their descendants. One thing that I want to point out is all of these descendants, like these here, these are all my cousins. All right, cousins of distant cousins, but cousins of varying degree. All right, and what we're looking at here are all of the descendants of David and Sarah. All right, this was a rather large family. All right, so there are tons of them, and that's not all. Because there are more of them off to the right. All right. So there's more of the family. All descendants of David and Sarah, and all distant cousins of mine. All right. Now, one thing that you probably notice is that a bunch of these relatives have black ribbons, black ribbon icons on their nodes. A black ribbon honors one of my relatives who was murdered in the Holocaust. And as you can see, there are quite a number of them. So here, for example, is an entire family that was murdered in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. So this is a very sad part of my family history, but one that I'm very interested in understanding and synthesizing. All right. So that's everything that I'm going to show you about this, this family tree for the moment. I mentioned that I also have a similar family tree for my father. It looks very similar to my mother's, although not nearly as big. What I want to talk about next is where did I get all of the information to build that tree? What do the records look like that I've been absorbing? And in order to talk about that, I have to talk about something called current handwriting. Current is the German cursive handwriting that was used from the medieval times all the way through 1941. So all German-speaking people wrote using this current. And I'm going to show you an example of it in just a moment. So not only were official records written in current, but letters that people wrote or shopping lists. All German speakers use this form of handwriting, and it's very different from the handwriting that I was used to. So again, in the interest of saving time, I'm going to skip that example and go to the second example. And this is the familiant record of my great-great-great-grandfather, David Feix. I'll show you in a moment where he is on the family tree. But first I have to explain what a familiant record is, because I'll bet that this is something that none of you know about. The familiant law was in effect for about 140 years. And it was an anti-Semitic law whose purpose was to limit the number of Jewish families in Bohemia, and limited to precisely 8,600. All right? This was out of a total population of millions of people who lived in Bohemia in those years. So 8,600 was a very, very tiny number to limit the Jewish families to. Now, how did the law work? How did they enforce this limit? Well, for any Jewish man to marry, he needed a special marriage permit. How did he get that marriage permit? He inherited it from his father. All right? Now, a father could pass on his marriage permit only to his oldest son. The rest of the sons were out of luck. Right? So only the oldest son could marry. He would inherit the marriage permit, marry, and then later on he could pass it on to his oldest son. So in this way, what you can see is that the number of Jewish families in Bohemia was limited to exactly the number of permits that were in existence. So in the early 1700s, they gave out 8,600 permits, and that limited the number of families to that number from then on. Now, how did the Austrian Empire keep track of these permits? It was the Austrian Empire that was responsible because Bohemia was part of the Austrian Empire. Well, they kept track of the marriage permits via these familiant records. This was a record that showed who had held the permit and who it got passed on to. So, as you can gather, this law was an exquisite mechanism for oppression of the Jews. But for genealogists like me, the familiant records are a gold mine. They contain a huge amount of information about the families. What I'd like to do is take a look at one of these records. The record I'm going to show you is the record of David Feix, who was my great-great-great-grandfather along this paternal line from my mother. So here's where he is. So this is actually a lovely example of Courant script. When I first saw records, tried to read records like this, I couldn't even tell what language they were written in because I couldn't recognize the letters. It turns out they were written in German, so that's fortunate because I can read German, but I couldn't read this. So let me just give you an example. This long skinny letter here, that's an H. This little squiggle here, that's an R. Let's see. This letter is a lowercase d. This letter here, that looks like, I don't know, a lasso maybe, that's an uppercase S. All right? So it took me quite a bit of time studying Courant alphabet charts and then trying to actually read records to be able to read the script. But I've had years of practice at it now, and I've gotten reasonably good at it. I can't read it as well as I can read modern handwriting, but better than I used to be able to. All right, so now let me show you the gold mine that's in this record. The original familiant in this family was David Feix. His name is here. In order to make this a little more accessible to you, I'm going to stop pronouncing the given names with their German pronunciation and pronounce them as we would pronounce them in English so that they're more familiar to you. So his name in English would, of course, be David. So David Feix. What do we know about David from this record? Well, here's his wife's name. Maybe you can read that, maybe you can't. That's an uppercase R. That's an A. That little bump is a C. This letter I told you already, that's an H. This letter that looks like an N is an E. And the last letter you can read, it's an L. All right? So David's wife's name was Rachel. They were married in 1787 in a town called Lipa. If we come over here, here's David Feix's name again, but let's look at it in Courant. This is an uppercase F. This letter that looks like an N you now know is an E. The next letter is an I. It looks just like an I would look to us. And this beauty is a lowercase x. All right? So that says David Feix. And what we learn here is that he died on the 13th of June, 1809. So that's useful information if you're trying to build a family tree. Now, if we go down a little bit, what's listed below are the names of all of David and Rachel's sons. No daughters, because the daughters weren't affected by the familiant law. All the empire cared to track were the sons, because they were the ones who could inherit the marriage permit. So that's too bad, because I really want to know about the daughters too, but I'm not going to learn about them from the familiant record. So here were the sons of David and Rachel. Abraham, Bernard, Moses, that was my ancestor, and Isaac. Isaac is the only one who has a birth date in this record. He was born in 1800. All right, if we now go down to the second row of the familiant record, we'll find out who inherited that marriage permit from David. So it was his son Bernard who inherited it. Bernard Feix was the next holder of the marriage permit. Having inherited that marriage permit, he married Sarah Altschul. They were married on the 19th of June, 1814. And they had two sons. Another David, named after his grandfather, who had died by the time this one was born. This David was born in 1816. His grandfather died in 1809. And Nathan, born in 1830. And now I can see there's a little more information about Nathan over here. It says that Nathan died on the 5th of June in 1830. That's the same year he was born. All right, so Nathan sadly died in his infancy, which is sad, but not at all unusual for those times. Let's go down to the next row. Now we can find out who inherited the marriage permit next. The next to inherit the marriage permit was the son, David Feix, who, with the marriage permit in hand, married Franziska Proper, married on the 24th of March, 1844. And they had a son named Michael, born in 1846. And that's where the familial record ends, because by the time Michael was interested in getting married, the familial law was no longer in effect. So there was no reason to keep these records up anymore. But you can see lots and lots of names and dates and relationships and places in this. And I didn't even go into that long paragraph of Courant and what's in there, which is a whole different story. So it really is a gold mine of information. So because I've gotten pretty good at reading Courant handwriting, I act as a translator for several Austrian and Czech genealogy groups where I help other members find records of their ancestors and read those records if they can't, because most of the members don't know how to read Courant. And if they don't speak German, I'll translate them into English. So that's everything I'm going to say about genealogy, and I now want to turn to family history. And as I said, what I'm going to tell you about is something about the lives of my parents and their immediate families during this short period, 1934 to 1949. This is the family history that I'm particularly interested in. I have written several drafts of a manuscript, a book that I'm writing about this family history. I find it fascinating. I don't know how you'll feel about it. We'll find out. You can think about what I'm about to show you as a trailer for the book that I'm writing. Not only a trailer, but also a spoiler, because I'm going to tell you a lot of the endings of the book. Good. Once you've seen this trailer, keep in mind that I'm in the market for a literary agent to represent the manuscript. And if you've got good ideas of an appropriate literary agent, send me a message. I'm very interested. All right. So here's a map of Europe. I'm going to be talking about these two families. The Tompa family is my father's family. That will always be in blue. And the Fikes family is my mother's family. That'll be in red. And here's all you need to know about those family trees. It'll stay down here throughout the trailer. In blue is my father's family. My father was Peter Tompa. He had an older brother, Hans, and a younger brother, Tibor. And their parents were named Adolf and Wilma. Adolf was a fairly popular name at that time, no longer for obvious reasons. So my father's family in blue, my mother's family in red. My mother was Liesel Fikes. She had an older sister, Mariana, and her parents were Ernst and Otti. Our story begins in Vienna in the year 1934. Now, I mentioned that my father's family was from Hungary, which is this country here, but by 1934, they had moved to Vienna. My mother's family was from Bohemia, which is here, and by 1934, they also had moved to Vienna. In fact, my mother and my father grew up 2 miles from each other in Vienna, but the families didn't know each other in Vienna. My parents wouldn't meet until much later in New York. We'll get there. All right. Now, here's another country. Well, let me mention something about Austria first. So Austria, which is of course where Vienna is, in 1934, Austria was still fairly peaceful, and my families were living pretty happy lives. But next door, in this large country here, this is Germany. And by 1934, the Nazi Party had taken control of the German parliament, and Adolf Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of Germany the year before, in 1933. And by the time this story begins, Hitler had imposed a number of anti-Semitic laws in Germany, making the lives of the German Jews quite difficult, laws restricting what they were allowed to do. But in Austria, as I said, things were still fairly peaceful in 1934, and not too many people were terribly worried yet, except for my uncle Hans. So my father's older brother, and I'll always show you down here at the bottom by highlighting in yellow, I'll show you who it is I'm talking about. So this is my father's older brother, Hans. He was a very clever man, and he foresaw that this was not going to be a good time for a Jew to be living in Vienna. And so he emigrated to the United Kingdom, to Wales in particular. Hans was a physicist, and he got a research position in physics in Swansea, which is a city in Wales. Apparently, he couldn't convince any of his family to leave Vienna because they all remained there. They remained there for the next few years, until 1938. 1938 was a momentous year in Austria, because what happened in 1938 is that the German army marched into Austria without firing a shot, and Hitler annexed Austria into the German Reich. Almost immediately, Hitler imposed all of these anti-Semitic laws on the Austrian Jews. And so suddenly, life for Jews in Austria became incredibly difficult. Many Jews clamored to get out of Austria at this time, after the annexation. And the Nazis would have been very happy to see them go. They encouraged emigration. They just wanted the Jews out, as long as they left their money behind. The problem was, why didn't more of them emigrate like my family? The problem was that they needed a country to go to, and many other countries around the world had severely limited their immigration, including the United States. Limited their immigration because there were so many Jewish refugees trying to get out of Europe. So it was difficult to go anywhere, and many stayed put. Shortly after the annexation, the rest of my father's family was deported from Vienna back to Hungary, where they had come from. And they ended up settling in Budapest. So this was everybody except for Hans, who was already in Wales. Hungary was a better place for them to be, so being deported there wasn't terrible news. At least they were out from under the thumb of the Nazis. The Nazis didn't control Hungary yet. But Hungary had a long tradition of anti-Semitism themselves, and they had instituted their own anti-Semitic laws limiting what Jews were allowed to do. So my father's family didn't want to stay in Hungary either, and worked to try to get out. All right. Now we had a red line. At about that same time, shortly after the annexation, my mother was sent by her parents to London. My mother was 18 years old at the time. She had just graduated from high school, but they sent her off on her own to London, where my grandfather had secured a position for her as a maid in an English family. Something that did not make my mother happy, but at least she was in a safe place, no longer threatened by the Nazis. All right, so now we move on to 1939. In 1939, Hans in Wales succeeded in getting entry visas to the United Kingdom for most of his family, everyone except for my father. So you can see highlighted below, his parents and his younger brother Tibor all immigrated to Wales and joined him in Swansea. The reason he couldn't get an entry visa for my father is that my father was of working age. And at that time, the United Kingdom's immigration laws didn't allow a working age man to enter the United Kingdom. They were trying to protect jobs for their own citizens. So my father was still stuck in Budapest. Just a few days after the family got to Wales, Germany invaded Poland. In retaliation, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany, and the United Kingdom closed its border. So if my father's family had been just a few days later, they would have been stuck in Budapest like my father. But they just made it in the nick of time. So this act of invading Poland is what started World War II, which went on for the next 6 years. Okay, now we need to zoom out because we need a bigger map for the rest of the story. We're now in 1940. The war is going on in Europe. And the first person to get one of these precious entry visas to the United States was my mother's older sister, Mariana, for herself and her husband and her toddler. So they set sail for New York in 1940 and settled in there, lived there for the rest of their lives. Now, this left, in my mother's family, this left my grandparents, Ernst and Otti, stuck in Vienna. They had waited too long. My grandfather was sure that they would be safe there, that this would all blow over, this Nazi phase, but he was very wrong. So they had waited too long, and they couldn't get an entry visa anywhere, try as they might. So what they discovered eventually was that there was one place you could go where you didn't need an entry visa, and that was Shanghai in China. And so my grandparents took a long rail journey from Vienna via the Trans-Siberian Railroad and then the Trans-Manchurian Railroad, ending up in Shanghai, where they lived for the next year and a half. All right, back to my father's family. My father really wanted to go to the United States, but couldn't make the Hungarian quota for entry there. But he did get a visa to go to the Dominican Republic. And so my father set sail for Santo Domingo in 1940. He had been a mathematician in Europe, an actuary, but not in Santo Domingo. In Santo Domingo, he found a job working for a rice exporter. And a large part of his job was going around on horseback or muleback, collecting rice and debts from recalcitrant rice farmers on the island. So quite a change for someone who had been a mathematician. And my mother, with the aid of a wealthy relative living in Rhode Island, also managed to secure an entry visa to the US. She wasted no time setting sail for New York after 2 years of working as a servant in London, something she described to me as the most miserable years of her life. She moved to New York and moved in with her sister's family, Mariana. All right. Now we come to 1941. After living in Santo Domingo for about a year and a half, my father finally made the Hungarian quota to the US and set sail for New York. This was just 10 days before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the US was at war and closed its borders. So if my father had been 10 days later, he would have been stuck in Santo Domingo and wouldn't have been able to get into the US, which wouldn't have been good news for me. Good. Now, at about that same time, my mother, who was now in New York, succeeded in getting entry visas for her parents, who were still in Shanghai. And she sent them those visas, and they took the first leg of the journey to the United States. That first leg took them from Shanghai to Manila in the Philippines. And this was a step closer to the US because the Philippines were a US territory. But as I said, this was just days before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And at the same time, Japan attacked Manila and the Philippine Islands. So my grandparents were caught in the bombardment of Manila. And after that, the Japanese army was in control of the Philippines. And so my grandparents were stuck under Japanese occupation. So imagine this. They had escaped from the Nazis, taken this long trip across Asia, only to fall into the hands of the Japanese occupation in the Philippines. And no one heard from them for the next 4 years until the war was over. So my mother had no idea whether they were alive or what had happened to them. In 1945, Germany was finally surrounded by the Allies and surrendered in May. And in August, Japan, which had been terribly bombed by the US, also surrendered. So this was the end of World War II. By this time, the Americans had liberated the Philippines, liberated all of the Japanese camps that were in the Philippines, gotten rid of the occupiers. My grandparents had survived the occupation and were able to complete their journey to the US, joining their daughters in New York. By this time, in 1945, my parents had met and married, and my grandparents moved in with them. All right, that's more or less the end of the story and the end of the spoilers. There's one more immigration that I wanted to mention, one more family member. A few years after the war, my uncle Tibor, my father's younger brother, sailed from London to New York and also moved in with my parents, who by this time had their first child, my brother. Okay, that's the end of the trailer, and you now know what the whole book that I've written is about. So there were some pretty somber and dark parts of that story, and I'd like to end today on a happier and lighter note. And for those of you who know me, and even those of you who don't know me but were paying attention to Anna's introduction, you won't be surprised to find out that the lighter side of the story I want to talk about is Schnapsen. All right. This is also part of my family history for a reason that I'll explain in a moment. As Anna told you, Schnapsen is an Austrian card game. It's a game for 2 players. And I learned this game as a child from my father and played it often with my father, with my brother, and with my uncle Tibor. So this is how it ties in with my family history. I forgot about the game after I left home, more or less forgot about the game, but rediscovered it about 13 years ago, and I'll tell you a little more about that rediscovery later. But I rediscovered it with a vengeance. I became very, very interested in this game and fascinated with the winning strategy for playing the game. Now, as part of this, again, as Anna already told you, I used Schnapsen as a running example of probability concepts in my course, which I found tremendous fun. But there was a requirement that any student who took probability and statistics from me had to learn the rules of Schnapsen. So we're talking about, over the course of 6 years or so, we're talking about thousands of students. This was a big class. Typically, I had 250 in each class. So lots of students indoctrinated to Schnapsen. I have to say, most of them liked this requirement. The Friday afternoon games that we played were completely optional. Nobody had to come. Nobody took attendance. And a large number of them came and played on Fridays. Out of this came the UW Schnapsen Club, which was an official Schnapsen club formed by some of our undergrads. And what you're looking at here is a picture of some of the founding members of the UW Schnapsen Club. I don't think they'd be too insulted if I said geeks, all of them, like me. good. So I'm just going to show you very quickly a bunch of pictures of students from the class playing Schnapsen. Here we are in Sieg Hall in 2015, paired up and playing. Here we are, a much bigger group in the Gates Commons in 2016, paired up and playing Schnapsen. In 2017, it's always a different group of students, right? These are always, it's a new crop of students, whoever was taking the class from me at the time. So here they are in 2017. Again, a much bigger group. This is in a lecture hall in Mary Gates Hall. This collection, this makes me very happy. We were without a doubt the center of Schnapsen in America. Nobody else in America knows this game. And here you're looking at probably 100 students playing Schnapsen. I think had my father lived to see this, he would have been tickled. At least I hope so. In that same lecture hall the next year, 2018, and in that same lecture hall the last time that I taught this class in 2020. All right. So all that remains are the thanks, which are very important. So I owe an incredible debt of gratitude to Richard Ladner, who hired me in 1978 as a postdoc. If it hadn't been for Richard, who knows where I would have ended up. I thought at that time that I was coming to UW to work with either Richard or Mike Fisher, who were the two big names in theory at the time when I came here. But in fact, it turned out that I came to work with Larry Russo, which I had no idea. I didn't know Larry until I interviewed here. But Larry Russo and I collaborated deeply together on lots of projects, both teaching and research, including 10 co-authored papers over the course of my career, going from space-bounded hierarchies in 1982 up to non-coding RNA in 2007. Larry has been a good friend throughout my career and an incredibly patient teacher. I learned almost everything I know about computational complexity and about probability and statistics from Larry. I want to thank two other good friends, John Zahorian and Larry Snyder, who made coming to work incredible fun. I want to thank all my grad advisees who led me kicking and screaming into new research areas that turned out to be very fruitful. In particular, I want to thank two of our former PhD students, Dick Garner and Jeff Schofield. They weren't PhD students of mine, but they were grad students at the time when I joined the faculty in 1978, and I became good friends of theirs. And the reason that I'm thanking them in this talk is because in 2011, Dick and Jeff came to me and asked me, did I know any good two-person card game that they could implement in OCaml on an iPhone, because they were interested in using this OCaml translator that they had, and a card game seemed like a good application. And it was that request that caused me to rediscover Schnapsen. And this was a turn in my life that turned out to be very important to me and of some importance to thousands of our undergrads. I want to thank our talented undergrads, who were some of my absolutely favorite teaching assistants, and also some of my favorite Schnapsen enthusiasts. I want to thank everyone in CSE, all of you, for providing such a supportive environment during my career. And let me add one more word, farewell. And finally, I want to thank all of my family for their love and support during this whole process, without which studying family history would have been pointless. All right. And now,
questions?
This is a great talk. Thank you for sharing all this. But I have a question. So what's so special about the 9?
The 9's in the deck?
Yeah.
Nothing. So let's see. You play Schnapsen with the 10s through aces of each suit. So 4 suits with 5 cards in each. And you play 66, which is the German version of Schnapsen with the 9s through the aces. So you ditch the 9s when you're playing Schnapsen. But there's nothing special about them.
It was an attempt on my part to be funny. Raj.
Yeah, first, my own thanks. So in 1990, I was an undergraduate in Texas, and I was looking at grad schools, thinking about whether I should go to Ph.D. or not. And I emailed a bunch of people in different places, and then there's only one professor who actually said, okay, I'll come and see you at the University of Washington. So I was in Seattle. It was actually you. So you were the one who encouraged me, and then now I'm a faculty member here. So thank you for that, acknowledgement of an undergraduate from a small university in Texas. And even though I'm not doing theoretical computer science right now, still I think I enjoyed that, period when I actually did do theory of computer science.
Oh.
And then in terms of genealogy, I've done a little bit of that myself from my family history. And one of the intriguing things, this is a question for you. One of the intriguing things I found was you discover other family trees that somebody else has also been doing. And then when they lock in, that's really a thrill to find this whole other set of family members who already done their work, and then you're sort of locking it into your family tree like a jigsaw puzzle. So I wonder if that's happened to you during your research, where you found other family trees?
Absolutely. It happens fairly frequently that I'll discover that someone else is working on a family tree, and I'll find a marriage record, and it turns out that the spouse of my member was in this other tree, or the father of my family member was in this other tree. So and the trees will merge, and suddenly my tree will grow. The absolutely best example I have of that, this is I'll tell it to you. When I was growing up in New Jersey, my parents had some good friends whose last name was Zeiler. So and the Zeilers were probably their closest friends. They were Czech Jews who had immigrated to the U.S. We grew up seeing the Zeilers quite often. They had 2 daughters in my generation, one of whom I'm still in contact with. Now, what I discovered about maybe a year or 2 ago, I suddenly discovered that the Zeilers are in my family tree. They are blood relatives. So I think, if I remember right, let's see, I think Harriet is my mother's 4th cousin. So a distant cousin, but a blood relative. And this I just found, well, it gave me goosebumps. And when I wrote to Harriet, she said she had goosebumps. It's just astounding, these 2 families who got along so well turned out to be related. And I have no doubt that our parents had no idea that they were related. They were related because you had to trace back to this Kornfeld family.
A couple of things. One, it's sort of disturbing to me how recent the history in Europe is, right? The Nazis coming in. You're only a generation away. And people here, a lot of people, the younger people particularly, say, what's Ukraine got to do with us? And that causes me to kind of go, whoa, this can happen again tomorrow. But anyway, the different question is, isn't reading current a good example of something that you could do with ML? And maybe there's some people here who could start recognizing patterns in it and starting to read some of the old things so you could actually digitize a bunch of these records automatically.
All right, so it's a good question. The question was, could you use machine learning to read current script? It's worth trying. My guess is it would be incredibly difficult, and the reason is simple. It's that everybody has a different handwriting, and as someone who's good at reading it myself, I know that there are some records that I can read pretty easily, like the one I showed you, and some that I really struggle with just because the handwriting is so bad. So maybe you could have some success with people who had clear handwriting. So there might be a subset of the documents that you could train a computer to be able to read. But I'm skeptical that you could do a large amount of these records.
Although you might be surprised to know how far ML has come in the last 5 to 10 years.
Well, let me ask you, just in normal script, how good, and I don't know the answer to this, how good is it at reading lots of different people's handwriting, including poor handwriting?
I think it's pretty good, but I'm not an expert. Okay, well, let's thank Martin and go outside to enjoy some refreshments. Thank you so much.